This video material looks at some of the things that you can think about when you are presenting and analyzing your results and data and moving through the stages of analysis. It might not necessarily work this way for every study because there are such different forms of analysis, there's such different kinds of data that we can use, but the basic principles here should be applicable in some or other way to a majority of studies that are being done at this level. I am a qualitative researcher, and so I very much come at this from that perspective, but I do also think that these basic stages can also be applied to thinking through quantitative analysis and other forms of more creative analysis as well. So when you start looking at your findings, you're typically going to be looking at different sets of data from different sources. You won't only have gathered all of your data from one source. At the very least, you will have done a comprehensive review of the literature of your field. That is a source of data. It's giving you information about why your study is needed, what possible gap you could construct in the field, and what kinds of research questions you can ask which are going to lead you to an argument. You will then have perhaps done different forms of field work. Either you will have spent time in an archive, you might have spent time in a lab doing bench work, you might have spent time in the field doing interviews or observations. You may have gotten a range of different data, documentary data, observation data, interview data, survey data. You may have actual physical data in the form of samples and results on the basis of those samples. You may have done computer modeling. You may have done lots of different kinds of things to get the data that you need to answer the research questions your study has posed. So the first step of analysis really then is to think about how to put this all together to make meaning. Because analysis at any level in research is about meaning making, particularly meaning making in relation to the research problem that has been posed and the research problem questions that we're trying to answer. So to make these meanings, you need to create a set of findings from your data, which means bringing together your results with your conceptual or theoretical underpinnings to think about what those results mean in the context of your study and in the context of the wider field that your study is part of. Then there are lots of different ways in which you can do this, and there will be ways in which your field chooses to do this and ways in which your field might not choose to do this. And I'm thinking particularly here perhaps of the more creative disciplines, which have particular ways of approaching analysis, and the more scientific disciplines. So there's not one right way of doing analysis. There's the way that your study needs you to do the analysis in order to find the meanings that your study requires so that you have evidence-based answers for your research questions. But you need to be able to explain to your readers how you use your theoretical underpinnings, how you use your conceptualized understanding of the world to see and analyze your data. How did you get from this is the problem to this is the solution? So those steps are a form of a translation device, if you like. And the clearer you can make that, the more credible, the more trustworthy, the more reliable and valid your findings are going to be. So we can think broadly of three stages of analysis. The first stage always, I think in just about any study, is going to be a form of description. To just really tell yourself, what data is there? I've spent time in the field, I've spent time in the lab, I've spent time in the archives, I've spent time talking to people, I've spent time observing people, I've spent time gathering data through questionnaires or surveys, whatever it is that you've done to collect your data. You've done some form of time just gathering, collecting, generating that data. And you will have it, as we said, from different sources. So the first step is really to sit with all your data and say, what is here? What have I found? What data do I have? And what data might I need? So this is a very iterative process between your data and your research questions. You don't ever want to forget your research questions at this point because you will almost always collect more data than you actually need for a doctoral study or a master's study by the same token. So you're going to need to choose data, right? So first of all, you just, and this is quite a useful point at which to actually write some narrative descriptions. What data do you have? What is there? What might you need? What are some of your reflections on the data? What did you think is interesting about the data? Have you already seen any connections during your field work that have occurred to you? Make some notes. And then you need to start thinking, what's the value of these data to the argument that I'm making? What might this all mean? So you're going to move up a level in terms of analytical thinking. You're not thinking descriptive anymore now. You're thinking analytically. You're thinking interpretively. What does this mean? How does this all connect together? Where are the common threads? In some qualitative studies, this might be called a form of thematic analysis, but that's not necessarily the only form of analysis at all. You'll be doing different kinds of analysis depending on your research question, depending on the methodological design of your study, and depending on your theoretical underpinnings. But the final stage really to reach is then to kind of say, how do I make my data speak back to or add to the field that I'm joining through how it's going to support the argument I'm making? So you need to theorize. You need to actually go one more level in your conceptual thinking to actually think theoretically. Now, not every study necessarily has a theoretical framework, right? In the sense of like you have a section of a paper or a section of a chapter of a thesis entitled Theoretical Framework. But you almost always have a set of abstracted understandings or principles against which you are measuring or evaluating or interpreting your data. Whatever your data is, whether you're working with novels, whether you're working with poetry, whether you're working with genetic samples, whether you're working with interviews with students, whether you're working with survey data, how are you actually making meaning? You're making meaning against an established understanding of something that already exists. And in relation to your study, your specific contextual study, this is going to be abstracted. And this is what you need to refer to explain and make meaning out of your data. And this is broadly speaking what we can call theory, although it will take different forms in different disciplines and in relation to different studies. So one of the things that's quite useful to think about is to picture a wave. At the highest point in the wave is the highest level of abstraction, right? This is where our sort of theory lives. Theory is by its very nature abstracted from reality. We can use theory to pull it down to reality and make sense of a particular problem or a particular context, but where it lives, by its very nature, it has to be abstracted from particular kinds of realities. The work we do as researchers is in those particular realities, and we use different kinds of theorized understandings of the world to help us make sense of those realities. So where we start off is at the bottom of the wave, where the greatest level of context exists, right? It's really not very abstract. It's very, in this data set, this is what I have. This is what the data is. This is what so-and-so said, or this is what happened in this particular experiment, or this is how the model ran, and this is what was found, etc. We can then wave up a little bit towards a higher level of abstraction when we start thinking, what does this all mean? Where are the patterns? Where are the connections? Where are the interesting findings here? How do these begin to connect with the literature that I've reviewed? How do these begin to connect to the research questions I've been asking? And then we can wave up to an even higher level of abstraction if that's required in our work to think, what is my theoretical understanding of the world? What does this abstracted theory help me to actually say about this? And you might, for example, be using feminist theory, different kinds of sociological theories, educational theories. In every single field, there's some kind of collection of abstracted principles, theorized understandings of how the world works, right? But this process isn't necessarily as neat and linear as that previous wave suggests. You might spend some time in description and then wave up a little bit to sort of think, what does this all mean? Where are the patterns? Oh, I need more data. I'm going to go back down into description and look at the data a little bit more. And then I'm going to do some more abstraction. And oh, okay, I can see where this connects in with the theory. And then you might wave down a little bit to do some more interpretive work and wave up again. Analysis in any discipline, whether you're doing quantitative work or qualitative work that draws on both qualitative and quantitative data, it's not going to be neat. It's not going to be linear. There's always a bit of back and forth. There's always a bit of what we call iterativity or in data analysis. It's always iterative. It's always backwards and forwards while you work on what these meanings are and what the answers to your research questions are. So in closing then, what we're doing in analysis is connecting the specific with the general. The specific is your study, the general is larger sets, agreed upon sets, common sets of understandings or explanations that exist in your field. And you will have accessed those through your literature review in the beginning of the process of your study. So these explanations come from theory and from literature potentially, right? So you need to be asking yourself all the time as you're doing your analytical work, what does this mean if I consider the theory or my conceptual understandings or the field's conceptual understandings of this problem that I'm looking at? How does it help me to explain these data in my study? Do my findings echo key findings in the literature? Do they challenge or extend key findings in the literature? How? Where's my evidence for the claims that I'm making? Always keep your research question in mind, because you need to choose the data that will help you answer this research question in the conclusion to your study. Hope this resource has been helpful and has given you something to think about and talk with your supervisory team about if you are working on your own analysis at the moment and feeling like you may be a little bit lost in the weeds or you're struggling to figure out where to get started.